Hello, and welcome to Actually Sustainable, the podcast for high achieving women who are wanting to build a life that is actually sustainable instead of burning out and living in burnout kind of constantly. All right, I am Rachel, a physician assistant, educator, ADHD-er, serial hobbyist, because I have 8 million hobbies. And I will be the one talking with you here today, like usual. And today, what we're going to be talking about is the reality of emotion. The last 2 weeks, this is episode 13. So it's the end of our initial kind of quarter. So the initial unit of this year's content, which was basically talking about some of the facts around burnout and information. And we'll move on to our next unit next week, where we learn some of how to unlearn some of these things that we've been talking about and unlearn living in exhaustion because we don't need to, right? But this week's message is on the reality of emotions. Last week, we talked about how burnout, grief, PTSD, and, a few other things can all, like depression, they all can kind of blend together. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they are independent. Sometimes they are dependent on one another. And resilience is a way of kind of your thought patterns around some of that stuff. Sometimes the emotions and all of those things get kind of jumbled together, and sometimes we can be resilient around them. Sometimes we need better skills. Sometimes we need true individual professional help. But overall, in order to get that resilient spot where we say, these are the thoughts that I'm having and these are how I'm perceiving this issue right now, and then changing that to a better, healthier way of thinking, we also have to recognize what emotions truly are. The basic understanding from a psychological perspective is that emotions really only last 45 to 90 seconds, depending on exactly what they are. So they are a response, an immediate response to whatever's happening. And from a physiologic standpoint, they don't last that long. The reason we stay angry or we stay sad or we stay happy or we stay whatever is that we continue to then think about them. We ruminate one way or another, whether it's a good rumination or a bad. We think about that situation and continue to have that feeling. There's a book that talks about it. The title is How to Un-F Your Brain. I'll put the link in the show notes. Just recognize that by the title, you should know there is a good bit of that foul kind of language in there. But she breaks the content down fairly digestibly, so you can kind of learn a lot of those pieces. I enjoyed a lot of what she said in there as well. And she talks about that burnout thing and how to kind of live a healthier life, a more resilient life. It was an enjoyable read. But she also talks about that time period and how we end up just reliving and re-examining what's going on with us and then continuing those emotions going forward. So if we're super angry over somebody and we're continuing to be replaying that situation over and over and over in our heads, we're going to continue being angry and we're going to get our blood pressure up and our heart rate up, and we can continue that for hours, days, weeks. And sometimes life circumstances and issues in the world warrant anger, but do we need to hold on to that all the time? And sorrow, big events, big losses, big changes, they have a lasting impression. They can kind of put a whole kind of blanket over everything and make it seem sadder, and we kind of filter everything through that lens, which that movie Inside Out, if you've ever watched that cartoon movie, they do a good job of that, and how, happy memories can end up kind of becoming bittersweet and things like that after big losses or big changes. That's slightly different than just the everyday emotion component that we're having. The other aspect of emotions and how we feel over a situation is, one, we can continue thinking about it and triggering our emotion. But two, it's how we perceive that situation that ends up informing our emotion. So somebody could go and run a 10-minute mile. And if their expectation was to run a 6-minute mile, running that would be probably disappointing because they were so much slower than they meant to be. But if they'd been running a 12-minute mile, then that exact same experience would end up having a significantly different emotional outcome because hey, I just ran my fastest time. I ran a 10-minute mile. Woo, that's awesome. Somebody who runs a 10-minute mile every day may go, yeah, that's my normal. I run my 10-minute miles and I'm good. So it's our perception of the situation, our interpretation of the situation that will inform our response to that situation. And then how much we kind of linger on it and continue to think about it will also inform which emotions we carry with us. And so with that resilience piece we talked about last week, in how we have some control over how we think about things. We may not be able to control the outcome immediately. We may not be able to control a lot of those pieces, but we can control our perceptions. When I'd like to tell you a bit of a story. I worked in emergency medicine for a while, as I've mentioned, and then I got really, really burnt out to the point where, it took me longer and longer every day just to get out of my car. I'd get there, my normal time, and then I'd end up being late to work because I couldn't make myself get out of my car in the parking garage. And then I'd show up on the floor and I'd see the tracker board and I would get sick in a trash can. I was way overdone. So I left and I went to Express Care for a while and I was basically bored out of my mind. I didn't enjoy that. It was fine. It was a good job and I liked the people and all of that, but it was kind of boring and it wasn't fulfilling in a lot of ways. And so I decided to try to go back to the emergency department and I started having panic attacks. I was having panic attacks for other reasons before that, which I might get into later, but I was really, really upset to go back and I was really fearful of how I was going to go back in. And I had been doing per diem on and off the years that I had been out of it full time, but this was me I was still per diem, but I was basically taking on full-time shifts because somebody was out. And so I had taken on this role and I was excited, but really, really nervous. And the first couple of days that I was back were very agitated because I just kept thinking about the bad circumstances, the bad patients that I had, the bad experiences. And I was ruminating on all of those negative components and all of my fear of doing the wrong thing and hurting someone instead of helping them. And then I decided that kind of rumination and that thought pattern wasn't the most helpful for me, right? Obviously it wasn't. It was limiting me and it was making me fearful and hesitant and timid. And being careful is one thing. Being timid and too cautious is not usually helpful in that setting. So I ended up kind of stepping back and I said, on my way home after that third shift, I ended up basically holding a funeral service in my car for the patients that I had lost over the years. I can remember their faces. I could hear the family members. I went through the whole experience and I basically had an emotional funeral for all of them. And then I said, okay, I'm human. Those are my mistakes or misses because we're not all perfect, unfortunately. And sometimes, no matter how perfect we are, in our setting, things still can go bad. And then I started remembering all the ones that I had done right by, the people that I had saved, the lives that I had caught the critical thing, hopefully early enough, and the people that I had treated and the people who had come back to give me hugs later when they felt better. And I took those memories and I chose to focus on them and find my purpose again and for doing it. And that gave me back my strength and my excitement and made me able to go back in. And I went back into the shift and the next shift. And I ended up really kind of enjoying it again for a while. And then my life went a little bit sideways and life had to change. Now I'm in family medicine, like I said, but I was able, and I really think if my schedule needs had lined up better with the positions, I would have been able to stay back in the emergency department and I could have potentially loved it again because I was enjoying it again in the capacity that I did it for at least that short period of time. And that was all, not all. I mean, I had been doing a lot of this research. I'd been learning, had gone to therapy, and, those kind of things. But so much of it was just my perception and which emotion I chose to focus on. And there's still the issues, there's still the stresses, there's still all of that. I couldn't eliminate those, and those do wear on you, and they're hard. But that perception, that looking at it and choosing to focus on the good side of the emotions and letting those be the ones that I brought with me into the department. And I consciously chose not to complain about certain things and not to bring that in with me to share with my colleagues. And I would actually leave spaces if people were complaining too much, because I was so close to kind of going back and backsliding into that emotional negativity. I couldn't be around people that would. And I even asked a couple of the nurses, like, hey, I understand you're frustrated, but please don't do that conversation around me. Wherever you need to do it, go do it, but just please not around me. And they tried to be respectful, and it was good. But I used those emotions, and, times where I started to feel overwhelmed, or the negativity would come back, or the fatigue, and not so much the fatigue, but the sadness that would come on. I could tell myself, hey, this is an emotion. If I change my thinking patterns, I can potentially change my emotion around this setting, whether for better or worse. And then I can either get through my shift and process those emotions separately later if I needed to. Or I could say, you know what? I got really mad at that patient because he was a jerk, but I'm going to choose to start thinking about something else. And then that anger for that jerk, because I go, hey, he's a jerk and he's going to potentially always be a jerk. Or, it was a bad day, or it was whatever. I had to convince myself, and I could just move on and not carry that anger and that bitterness and grumpiness on with me to the next step of my day. And it was a bit of a separation that I needed from those circumstances. So the same thing, if you guys have a boss or a coworker or somebody, again, if it's super consistent, if it's obviously do the HR things, do the changes that we talked about in terms of the resilience side, but also our perceptions and how much we choose to ruminate on and keep thinking about the things that bring us down can be a big part of it. So that is kind of how emotions work. Obviously, that's easier said than done. There's a bunch of skills to help us get there. A lot of people are not very self-aware and don't understand what they're actually feeling or why they're actually feeling. So we're going to get into that kind of going forward. But if you are self-aware enough to kind of go, oh, I'm sad now, and that's because I keep thinking about this thing that is making me sad, maybe I need to process that in some way, or maybe I can try to think about it from a different perspective and see if I can change my emotional response, or I can think about something different altogether to change my emotional response, because right now is not the time to process that feeling. So yeah, so I will put the books in the show notes, and we will move on from there going forward. Now, remember, disclaimer for this is, this is not meant as medical advice nor therapy. This is not a replacement for any kind of licensed professional care or interactions. And yeah, we'll see you next week. Bye.